Hey team, and welcome back to the channel. So this would normally be the time where I'd be talking with you about any sort of upcoming talismanic elections, but there aren't any very good ones to share for this moon cycle. That's primarily due to the rather poor conditions of the planets who aren't able to really support any workings right now. Mercury, Jupiter, and Saturn are all retrograde, while Venus is square Mars and then close enough to the Sun to be combust. There are some kind of very specialized utilizations for retrograde and combust planets, but they're normally considered to have adverse effects on talismanic operations. This also will heavily restrict the signs that we can use on the ascendant, with Taurus, Gemini, Virgo, Libra, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces all unable to be used. This leaves us with basically just the Moon, the Sun, and Mars as planets who aren't immediately unavailable, and then Cancer, Leo, Aries, and Scorpio are the only signs we could use as potential ascendants to work with. So anyway, it's just not great right now, so we're kind of forced to take a break, and that's fine. Rest is an important part of any kind of practice, rest and consolidation. So instead of that, we are going to talk about another topic that generates a lot of emotions and thoughts, and that is the idea of remediation. So what is remediation? And this is something that is probably going to depend a lot on who you're asking. But since this is my channel and I'm asking myself, I am going to say that my definition or my kind of current understanding of remediation is that it is any intentionally applied action that seeks to reduce the harm or increase the benefit of any astrological placement or configuration. For many, the idea of astrological remediation, or the ideas that it calls to mind, is heavily influenced by practices that are more commonly found in the Yodish astrological tradition. This tradition has sort of a standard set of tools that are used to help people better navigate or handle astrological configurations that have resulted in difficult lived experiences. Probably the most well known is the association of each of the planets with a gemstone, and regularly wearing jewelry that incorporates this specific gem is said to transmute some of that difficult energy into something more conventionally positive. While not as well known as gem recommendations, mantra recitation is another commonly used tool for remediation in the Yodish tradition. Here, the individual is given a word or a phrase to repeat so many times at regular intervals, either daily or weekly. My understanding is that the sort of typical or standard prescription is the recitation of a mantra 108 times for a 40-day period. The mantra is said to hold spiritual power, that its repetition coupled with the dedication of the individual following the prescription work, they work together to lift some of the burden off of that person that may be caused by some planet or configuration in their natal chart. Mantra recitation may also be commonly paired with yantra worship or meditation practices. A yantra is a geometrical design that's used to represent a divinity, or maybe sometimes called like a pictorial representation of a mantra, and helps practitioners better connect to that deity. These sacred symbols are usually included as part of an altar or temple construction, and performing recitations or particular meditation practices with the yantra help in reducing negative lived experiences caused by planetary forces in the natal chart. Finally, a fourth common tool in the Yodish remediation toolbox is planetary charity. This is when an individual is instructed to volunteer time or donate money or even specific objects to charities or causes that are associated with whatever planet they are seeking to develop a better relationship with. Sometimes this might even be in feeding animals associated with that planet. The idea behind planetary charity essentially is one wherein we are working to correct karmic imbalances or debts. The reasoning goes that someone has a planet that is in poor condition in their natal chart, and that is because they have developed some sort of bad karma with that planet or surrounding its significations in a past life that now is being expressed in this one, and more positive karma can be generated through intentional donations and acts of giving. Different planets have particular causes or items that are recommended to support or give, and an astrologer helps you figure out what works best for you. So those are some examples of astrological remediation from the Yodish tradition. I do not consider myself an expert or even very well informed on these matters, so please don't quiz me about Yodish remediations in the comments. I will cry. However, I wanted to talk about these to help kind of frame the conversation as examples of remediation from a very established tradition. So if that's what Yodish astrology uses as forms of astrological remediation, what does the Western tradition have to say? Almost nothing, really? The relationship between conventional Western astrology and remediation is a complicated one that requires us to kind of stretch out our understanding and conceptualization of what remediation is. Something that I think is interesting is comparing the very different kind of religious framework between the Western and the Yodish systems. Yodish astrology grew up alongside a religious tradition that is inherently polytheistic and allows the planets to have individual deities and wills that a person can have a relationship with and develop a spiritual connection and religious practice surrounding. Western astrology, on the other hand, has spent the past 1200 or so years in cultures that are predominantly monotheistic, either through the lens of Arabic Muslim cultures or European Christian ones. For the most part, the planets in these cultures are viewed not as having independent wills, but more or less as cogs in the celestial machine that is all an expression of God's or Allah's will. Western astrology, of course, did not begin in these monotheistic cultures, and we have fragments of examples of rituals from Mesopotamia, Egypt, and polytheistic Greece that centered on the worship of stars to intercede on behalf of humanity. The stars and planets invoked in these rituals were seen as representations of individual gods, and it was well within their religious framework to beseech these stars for assistance in worldly matters. Come here, Lee. In the Greek magical papyri, we see, hey, no, don't, no. Let's get up here. Sorry. In the Greek magical papyri, we see rituals for the creation of amulets to mitigate the effects of astrological forces, and even rituals to help one renegotiate their fate that's set out for them in the natal chart. We might also argue that the decline of astrological remediation didn't begin with astrology's absorption into monotheistic cultures, but with Greek philosophical... Lee, are you being toxic? We might also argue that the decline of astrological remediation didn't begin with astrology's absorption into monotheistic cultures, but probably with Greek philosophy, particularly the Stoics. Stoicism is a branch of philosophy that posits the best way to live is in harmony with nature, and that true happiness comes from accepting and living in accordance with one's fate. If fate is a river, then it's easiest to lie back in your floaty tube and float down it than it is to struggle by trying to swim against the current. Obviously, remediation and supplication to gods for intercession is not really part of the Stoic plan. Oops. Even as astrology made its nest in Muslim and Christian cultures, sources of older remediation practices still existed, the Picatrix being an obvious example. This book contains instructions for many astrological talismans that can assist an individual in almost any area of life. While not explicitly remedial in the way that we might think of it, I would argue that using a planetary talisman to affect an outcome is astrological remediation in a very literal sense. We're using astrology to fix a problem. Similarly, Picatrix is primarily focused on the creation of talismans and petitions to planetary spirits, normally for some kind of worldly or material gain. There isn't a whole lot of what we might consider like explicit spiritual development content in this text in a way that we, might get from like Iamblichus and Theurgy. We do catch some glimpses of some useful information or implications if we read between the lines, though. At one point, the Picatrix author tells us that individuals will more easily petition and have greater efficacy in their petitions towards planetary spirits who are well placed in their natal chart. The obvious implication here is that planets that are not well placed in the natal chart will not be as easily reached or will require more effort to be successful. To me, this sounds very similar to the karmic idea in the Yodish tradition. You have a particular relationship with each of the 7 planets, and that relationship is both knowable because it's reflected in the condition of that planet in your natal chart, and it has a direct correlation to that planet's attitudes towards you. So it's knowable. I can look at a chart, I can see the planetary configurations, and I can tell you which planets you have a bad relationship with. And this is also experienced in that the areas of life or the situations this planet represents will be experienced as concrete, difficult, uncomfortable, or frustrating life experiences. Astrology and magic in the Arabic Muslim tradition started to work more towards framing both within Islamic theology. We've stepped away from the idea of the planets and stars as individual spiritual entities or deities with their own wills and agendas, and more towards a cosmos that is ordered under the authority of one supreme deity. Invocations, petitions, and prayers begin to include phrases that acknowledge the supremacy and will of Allah, while sort of asking permission from Allah for our magical workings to be successful. The planets and stars are now instruments of Allah's will and do not have the authority or means to act outside of that without special permission. This means that the language of petitions or invocations now has to include some kind of thing like if Allah wills it, or through the permission of Allah. The Picatrix text sort of has a foot in each camp in this matter, which is not surprising, considering it's basically a syncretic work of various magical books. Some places in the Picatrix appear to suggest that the planets are their own divine things, while others clearly show that the planets are obedient to Allah, or somehow dependent on Him for their powers. The planetary invocations in Book 3, Chapter 7 are filled with references to Allah or otherwise explicitly state that Allah has given this planet such and such powers. We see these same kinds of themes as we move into medieval Christendom. Magic and astrology become absorbed into this worldview and hampered by it to some extent. There is plenty of room, as there was in the Muslim phase of the tradition, for a magical practice that is obedient to God and follows, we'll say, the letter of the law. Prayers to the saints or angels became a linchpin in medieval religious practices, many bordering on what most of us would consider magical today. But there is, of course, the understanding that all is in accordance with or allowed by God's will. So it's actually not, bad at all. It's not magic at all. It's just God's will. The planets and stars are again understood as cogs in the divine machine and expressions of God's will. They may be granted authority to do various things by God, or be symbolic of otherwise unknowable aspects of God, but they are not in themselves gods or deities, and lack what we'll call executive function. Natural magic also becomes more of a tool in this time period, and now I'm absolutely certain that natural magic was utilized in Muslim cultures. I'm just much more familiar with it in European cultures. But if anybody watching has any recommendations for books or videos or lectures that talk more about the application of natural magic in Muslim cultures, please share those. I would love to have access to it. Natural magic is basically the application of natural resources for magical purposes without the explicit invocation of a spirit, or without the sort of explicit participation of a spirit, we'll say. Wearing an agate stone to help with public speaking or a speech impediment without performing any kind of ritual is an example of natural magic. That's just something the agate stone can do by itself. Wearing an amulet that incorporates a peony to help fight epileptic seizures without performing some ritual is a form of natural magic. This is a legitimate medical treatment for epilepsy. It's just what peonies can naturally do. Carrying a ruby for protection against plague or poison without performing some ritual is a form of natural magic. Again, that's just something that the ruby can do. I don't have to ask it. Basically, natural magic is a branch or application of magic that seeks to utilize an object's inherent natural properties, which may border on the magical or the superstitious, depending on how you look at it. Natural magic was a theory behind why herbs and stones had various medicinal or protective applications, and the idea was that God put these things here and gave them these inherent properties. Just as we might build our homes out of wood we might make from trees from a forest that was part of God's creation, we might also use lemon balm for its natural anti-anxiety properties, and it would be blasphemous not to appreciate and to use God's gifts to their fullest potential. Fun fact, this same line of reasoning was also used to argue the acceptability of conventional or secular medicine in the early Middle Ages against those who believed that healing through anything other than basically works of faith was a satanic delusion or a conspiracy. This proves, once again, that things really don't change all that much. Marsilio Ficino, in his 3 books on life, performed a lot of the heavy lifting in providing something more similar to an astrologically oriented remediation practice. While Christian magic and remediation focused on prayers and supplications to God or calls to his angels and saints with his permission or authority, either implied or explicitly asked for, Ficino took a different route. Ficino's 3 books on life were primarily focused on health and longevity. These were obtained, in Ficino's opinion, through an assortment of lifestyle factors and practices that could be adopted by anyone to use as stepping stones to improve their quality of life. The text was written primarily for scholars or those who led similar lifestyles as scholars, and of course, the wealthy, who would be able to afford to partake in some of the text's more interesting practices, like ruby smoothies, which is a real thing. As the name suggests, the text is divided into 3 books. The first is On a Healthy Life, which spends most of its pages talking about Greek medical theory, humoral physiology, and steps to refine the black bile into something more health-affirming. The second book is On a Long Life, which spends most of its time on lifestyle choices to help people live longer, focusing on diet, exercise, and activities. Finally, the third is On Obtaining Life from the Heavens, and is the most explicitly magical of the 3 books. On Obtaining Life from the Heavens talks about the utilization of planetary talismans and natural magic to create a better health experience. This is the most explicitly astrological remediation focused part of the text, but the astrological remediation really permeates the entire text, as most of Ficino's methodology revolves around intentional application of what he calls the 3 graces, the planets Venus, Jupiter, and the Sun. Even in areas of the text where they are not identified as such, many portions will have foods and herbs suggested or recommended that fit under the authority of one of these 3 planets. What's unique to Ficino's approach is that his remediation is not just something that happens through the creation or applications of astrological talismans. It is a holistic approach where every area and activity of life is examined, and influences of Venus, Jupiter, and the Sun are chosen to replace the influences of other planets that may be doing harm. While wearing health-affirming talismans is part of it, it also includes considerations for things like how you dress, the company you keep, the media you consume, any supplements you take, what food you eat, the profession that you practice, actions or activities you take part in, and even the decor of your home. All in all, there are a lot of tools in Ficino's work that can be easily used as part of an astrological remedial practice, and brings it back more closely in spirit, in my opinion, to its ancient and Yiddish counterparts. It also paints a picture of a practice that is not something that takes place solely in front of an altar, which was likely intentional on the author's part to avoid being called a heretic. We typically try to avoid that as much as we can here, but has the ability to be incorporated in every facet of a lived experience. While Ficino's examples are almost exclusively centered around Venus, Jupiter, and the Sun, with few references to the other planets, it only takes a little bit of know-how or astrological familiarity to create similar systems for any planet that we might want to connect with. So those are some examples of historical ideas surrounding astrological remediation. Obviously, this was not a comprehensive guide. I just wanted to sort of hit some highlights that have been meaningful to my practice and understanding, but there is so much more out there in the history of magic and religion that could be mentioned here as well. As we're starting to wrap up this video, I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about my practices or understanding regarding astrological remediation. I kind of gave it away at the start, where I offered my definition of astrological remediation as any intentionally applied action that seeks to reduce the harm or increase the benefit of any astrological placement or configuration. The implication here that some may find strange or disagree with is that I don't think magical or religious avenues are the only ones through which remediation can take place. I think this more open interpretation of what it means to remediate helps open the door to these kinds of practices to those who may be uncomfortable with overtly religious or spiritual methods. You don't want to create and maintain a devoted altar space? Well, that's fine. Here are some other things you can do, and maybe we can get you to where you're comfortable with that later on, or not. That's fine too. One of the easiest ways to start a remediation practice is by adapting up to upcoming transits or activations in real time. By this I mean altering your habits or life to create landing pads for these transits to manifest in. I tend to believe that astrological signatures take the easiest path down the river to impacting our lives, and by closing off or intentionally creating openings for these impacts to occur in, helps to limit the damage or focus the good that they can create. A recent example of this from my own life is that when transiting Mars came to square my ascendant, I decided to get my COVID booster. This was partly because I know that the side effects of these vaccines can be a bit more on the difficult side, and partly because I enjoyed the symbolism with it. Mars is the needle. It pierces, it penetrates, it pokes. Mars in Gemini Gemini, which is the sign associated with the arms, is the injection site. And so it all just lined up really well, and I just really like that. So I get my booster at the square. The next day, my arm hurts. I'm having those slight body aches, some light chills, and just overall feel kind of crummy. But it's fine. I just took the day off work, watched TV, popped some Tylenol, ate, took a nap, and the next day I'm great. If the Mars squared to my ascendant was going to manifest as a difficult day where I felt discomfort or pain in my body for some reason, I wanted to have some say in what that reason was. So I gave myself a reason to have a crummy, uncomfortable day, rather than leaving it to Mars to decide what that day should have been like for me. This is something of a cornerstone to my own astrological practice and client work, where when I see that people are going to experience something, we work to strategize the best way to make the most out of that something. Clients who got caught at the bad end of this past Mars-Saturn conjunction, especially if they had it configured to like their ascendant or ruler of the first house, we needed to come up with a way to put controlled pressure on the body. So for many of those individuals, I recommended a weightlifting or sort of other form of resistance training practice. Someone having transits that look like good opportunities to make money, I need you to take a break from any mobile games you might be playing, because the last thing I want is for you to blow that transit on some rare in-game item when it could have been real cash money. A single person with good transits for romance, download some apps, get out of the house. This doesn't work all of the time, especially when it comes to transits or activations that include other or multiple people. For example, if some kind of configuration is coming up and a potential outcome for that is a loved one gets sick or hurt, there isn't a lot that you can do on a personal level to mitigate that, because now we're talking about another person and their own willingness to engage. It only indirectly affects you, so you just kind of have to witness it happening to somebody else, so there isn't really a lot of strategizing to pull that influence into some other place in your life. More overtly magical practices can do that, but this is definitely a weakness or the sort of mundane strategizing method. One thing that I want to be clear about this is that I think language is important here. One dichotomy I really don't like in astrology is the language that surrounds evolved and unevolved people and their experiences with astrology. This is language that I think developed more out of the 1960s and 70s popular astrology, but the idea really is much older and goes back to kind of Christian apologist positions in regards to astrology. Truthfully, I don't really see this kind of language being used as much as I used to, but I think anyone watching who has been interested or involved in astrology for a while will know what I'm talking about. Basically, the idea is that there are two types of people. There are the evolved individuals who, by meeting certain kind of nebulous criteria, which is usually described as attaining some degree of like spiritual openness or self-actualization or something, experience less negative effects from astrological transits and embody more of the positive expressions or potentialities in their natal chart. Obviously, this means that there's an outgroup of unevolved individuals who have not done this work and so tend to experience the more challenging or downright hard outcomes of transits and embody the more difficult or challenging potentials of their natal charts. I've never really been comfortable with this kind of phrasing, partly because I see it as very victim-blaming towards people who experience a transit negatively, and partly because, like I said, it reminds me a lot of kind of Christian apologist attitudes towards astrology. Here, it's argued that there are two different types of astrology. There is natural astrology, which is more astrology as a branch of physics, and discusses allegedly measurable effects of astrology on the world, things like moon phases and ocean tides, the sun and weather and seasonal patterns, the stars as navigational tools and markers for agricultural activities, and the moon's effects on the body and health. That's kind of the natural astrology, and that stuff is fine. The other type of astrology is judicial or superstitious astrology, as it was sometimes called. This is the fun astrology that we're all here for, right? It's the horary, the natal, the astrological magic, any kind of astrology that is used to get insight into a person and how they think, or decisions that they might make. This is where we get into kind of Christian problems, because now astrology competes with the incomprehensible will of God and clashes with our supposed radical free will. I'm getting like really heavily into theology in this video. I didn't anticipate all of this, and I'm kind of quickly losing control of it all. But it all basically comes down to something like, that Venus transit didn't cause you to cheat on your partner, Jonathan. What it might have done is stirred up feelings of lust in your body, but you chose to act on them. If only you had been more pious and right with God, this wouldn't have happened, but you didn't, and now you've sinned, so take your big red A and get out. I don't see a very big difference between this kind of attitude and telling someone that if only they had been evolved or spiritually aware or whatever, this bad thing that happened to them wouldn't be happening. It's just not a good look. What I tend to more think of it as, and how I describe it to clients, is the difference between a transit or timing technique that is tamed and one that is wild. So you see something coming along down the pipe, and you can choose to do your best to select your experience. You can try to tame the transit and do what you can to strategize some symbolically accurate ways to make something constructive with the transit. This is you kind of taking the reins and leading it where you want it to go, or trying to at least. The alternative is to do nothing and let the planet kind of decide how and what it wants to do within its dictionary of kind of symbolic manifestations. I don't think either option is inherently right or wrong, and I don't think that choosing to do nothing makes you unevolved or not spiritually aware or a bad person or whatever. For every transit that I personally take an interest in taming, there are probably like 5 others that I just let go, like whatever. Even in a consultation setting, if we're talking about the next 3 months, and there might be like 10 things that we spend time talking about, but out of those 10, there's probably only like 1 that I actually want to approach with a heightened level of concern. Otherwise, it just gets to be too much and overwhelming, but sometimes there are things coming that are worth pushing back on. I also don't think that viewing astrology as exclusively a thing that happens to you means anything about your character or spiritual development. It's just not really how we think about astrology until we experience otherwise. So we just aren't aware that options are things we can have until we work with an astrologer who helps us get that process started. So I got a little off track here, I think, but I wanted to take some time to talk about how even mundane and practical things can be considered remedial activities to make it less mystical or weird for people who don't come at this with a magical or religious background, but now that's taken care of, we can talk about more of that fun stuff. When it comes to the magical path for remediation, we have a lot of options. Like I said near the beginning, a lot of our understanding of remediation is colored very heavily by the Yodish tradition. Remediation is not part of the Western tradition of astrology that has, we'll say, survived some of its culture clashing that it's witnessed. So if you were to ask a practitioner of astrological magic for some tips or methods of remediation, you'll probably get those same 4 things out of them: mantras, talismans, devotionals, charity. I don't say this to criticize it. All of these are very valid forms of remediation, and it's all about finding which one fits best for your situation. I just wanted to point it out to kind of highlight the overlap of how these 2 practices are interacting and likely have been interacting since the beginning. I also don't mean to imply that talismans, mantras, devotionals, and charity are exclusive to or original to Yodish astrology or Hinduism. Obviously, that's not true. A lot of the time, the first step someone seeking remediation would be offered are talismans. This is for 2 reasons, I think. The first is that they are seen as the most immediate and noticeable, which tends to make people think they are the most powerful and effective. The second reason is that they are expensive and someone is trying to sell it to you. I don't think going to talismans first is ever really a great plan, as in my experience, it has only ever made the situation worse. Not unlike it's going to be worse before it gets better kind of way, but like, oh God, it won't stop. What have I done to deserve this kind of a way? It's not good. Generally, some combinations of devotionals, charity, and recitations are the best way to get started. What that looks like for you will depend on comfort level, accessibility, and whatever the situation you're trying to get help with looks like. Setting up a dedicated devotional or meditation space to that planet can be something really fun to do. Beginning a meditation practice at specific astrological times is a great way to get started. Finding a charity to donate to that matches the themes of the planet can be a really great way to give back. There's just a lot of room here to explore and play around with and find what you like. If going full steam into astro-idolatry isn't for you at this stage, that's totally fine. We do have other ways to do things based off of the works of Marsilio Ficino that I talked about above. I like Ficino's approach a lot, and I will jokingly refer to it as a Western feng shui. For this method, we might ask questions like, how do you dress? What colors do you like to wear? What colors do you not like to wear? And what does that say about your relationship to those planets that signify those colors? What do you eat? How do you eat? Do you have any food sensitivities or allergies? And what does that say about your relationship with the planet associated with that? Are you open to exploring dietary adjustments? What about scheduled fasting? What's your daily agenda like? Can we carve out time to do a planet-focused activity? The list goes on, as what we're doing is we're looking for places in life where we can intentionally invite or slot in a specific planetary focus and start to turn that relationship into something more positive until we start seeing real, lived, positive results. Then you can have your talisman to keep the work going if you want. Something I think worth talking about also is how much remediation is too much, and how the sort of normalization of remediation can create some weird philosophical pitfalls. Everyone deserves to live a better, more fulfilling life, and whatever way that looks like to them, that doesn't harm anyone else. And if astrological remediation can take some pressure off of your lived experience, you should absolutely go for it. Where things get complicated is when we start trying to remediate everything or continually view ourselves as a problem. Fate is a weird thing, and it's really difficult for us to have a good sense of where things are going and where metaphorical doorways or paths in our lives will take us. I talked earlier about how when astrology became more comfortable with monotheistic religions, the prayers and supplications to planetary or angelic spirits usually came with some kind of clause to allow the petition if God or Allah gives his permission. I actually think this is really smart. Obviously, it doesn't have to be a statement made specifically to God or Allah. It can be, to whatever spiritual force or organizing principle that you see as having a higher station than yourself. Something that can see the maze of time from a more bird's eye view than we do and can help us to kind of course correct when something that we think we might want actually brings us unintended consequences that we didn't see coming. Remediation is a very powerful tool to help people feel a little bit more comfortable in the natal chart that they have been born with. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to reconfiguring planetary influence, which can make it a little tricky to maneuver, but thankfully there is no one true path to get results. I hope this video has sparked some further interest in astrological remediation. If that's the case, I would like to recommend 3 books on life as a primary source text to turn to. You might also consider subscribing to my Patreon, where we have these kinds of conversations all the time. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time, where hopefully I will have some talismanic elections to share with you. So everybody take care, and I will see you guys all again on the Aries full moon.